Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of our Grow Summer Sessions. My name is Luke. I'm on our pastoral team here at Living Waters Church, and throughout the summer, we've been gathering on Thursday nights live here on YouTube and having conversations about all kinds of things that connect to faith and connect to everyday life, specifically things about our growth as human beings. We're about, I don't even know how many sessions we are into this right now. I think we're 6 or 7. We've got 2 left. And tonight, we're really happy to have a conversation about the arts, which is something that we don't often do in church, even though churches are all about the arts in many respects. Tonight, we are going to be having a talk called God is a Poet, How Art Enlivens Faith. And our friend who's joining us tonight is Peter Morelli. Peter is a teacher. He also earned his PhD in English from Cambridge University in England. And we're really happy for him to join us tonight and to discuss this topic of how art enlivens faith. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. The first is if you're joining us live, we're welcoming questions throughout the next hour that we're spending together. So you can feel free to type your questions into the comment section on the side. We'll keep track of those and ask as many of those questions as we can once we get a chance to have a conversation with Peter, which leads me to that second piece of housekeeping information, which is the format of the evening. Peter's going to present for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then after that, I'll join him up here, and we'll have a conversation for another 30 minutes or so. And at that time, you can ask questions. You can also ask questions anytime during Peter's talk, and we'll make sure to track those as we go. I think that's all we have for you tonight in this kind of lazy summer evening, but it's a great time, laziness, to create and to ask questions of creating. So thanks for joining us, Peter, and welcome. Thanks so much for spending your evening with us.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. So Luke was very kind to offer an introduction of who I am and a bit of what I'm about, but I'll just start by saying while I may have studied literature and art and politics at university for a healthy 10 years or so, my efforts to understand the relationship between creativity and faith are actually much greener. And it's only been the last few years that I've begun to explore this relationship with much more curiosity and intent. The catalyst for that sudden interest was, of course, a deepening of faith. And since no aspect of life is close to God, as my faith deepened, eventually my creativity and creative practice were opened up to him too. And I started to wonder and have conversations with him and ask, so what is the relationship between my creative work and you, good sir? And some of the answers I've received to that question, I'll share with you tonight. So as we get going, I'll just ask that you please open up the handout that's available to you online, PDF there, if you haven't done so already. As I refer to that as we move through things, and you can follow along and read along, and in one case, view an image that's there. So we'll start with the question: what does it mean to say that God is a poet? How is God a poet? For me, my response to that is immediately that it's legitimate to understand God as a poet and to call him such, because the words poet and poetry both come from the ancient Greek word we translate as poesis, which means creation or production, or in verb form, to make, create, produce. So while today we understand a poet to be a person who composes poetry and a poem or poems, and when you're being less kind, perhaps you think of some sort of dilettante. The deep origins of the word are all about making and creation. The poet is a maker and a creator. So to call God a poet is essentially to call him a maker, a creator, to call him the maker, the creator. And I personally really like that, because as one of the many names of God, each of which draw attention to specific aspects of his character, poet is a name that emphasizes the brilliant and beautiful, powerful artistry of his creativity, his making, his creation, and what that means for us. And that's what we're all about this evening. So tonight, I want to explore how art and the creative imagination enliven faith and bring life to Scripture. I also want to explore the way in which faith inspires art and flip it a little bit, because this too is a really important thing to consider when discussing the relationship between art and faith. Ultimately, I hope that by the end of this, we'll have gained a sense of the incredible way in which the imagination, creativity, and creative work can deepen and intensify our faith, and even lead us into creative partnership with God. So let's get into it. We'll start by talking about how art enlivens faith. Before we go further, I do want to clarify that by art, I'm talking in general, into a general category of, literature, poetry and prose, visual arts, music, and so on. So when I use the word art, I am referring to the general category of all created works or creative works. And as you listen and follow along, do think of whatever specific medium you favor when I use the term. So if you're a writer, think of writing. If you're a poet, think of poetry, visual artists, paintings, and so on. You get the picture. Now, there are all sorts of straightforward statements in the Bible that we just read and then flash by, right? We often kind of understand them as truth, but we don't always think about what's really going on there or spend a lot of time envisioning what it is that we're being guided by the language to imagine. And of course, I don't really want to oversell the idea that we don't read Scripture closely, because of course we do that in all sorts of circumstances, and we make it a practice to read Scripture carefully and closely. But when you become familiar with the Bible or you read it extensively, sometimes you can fall into this pattern where you feel like you know what it all means, and therefore you can read quickly and for sense rather than for depth and significance, right? But when we do that, we start to miss out on the richness of what we're being offered. And basically we miss the poetry, right? And therefore the ideas and concepts and the real immensity of what is there doesn't explode for us as it really should, right? And we can track this all out, starting with the first line in the Bible, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? If you read that just get into it and not really think about what's going on there, it's just a straightforward statement about the functional act of creation. God created the world. There was nothing, God made something. But that's actually where the imagination has to step in, and where art and poets step in and say, hey, wait a second. Let's really think about what's going on there. God created the heavens. What do the heavens that he created look like? And let's join them and imagine for a moment, what did things look like before the act of creation? Have you ever gone there in your mind? That space that was there before creation, right? What might God look like at that initial moment of creation? What did the act of creation actually look like? And if you put the effort in to do that imaginative work, all of a sudden that verse, God created the heavens and the earth, will probably have come to life for you, right? There's a type of deep understanding that develops from that type of imaginative response and a vision of what it might have been like during that moment of creation will emerge for you. And so to continue with this, let's look now at two examples of poets who responded to the creation story and see how this works a little bit. We'll start by reading a passage from Milton's Paradise Lost, which was published in 1667. It's there in the handout, so please do follow along as I read. In the passage, the angel Raphael is telling Adam how the world in which he finds himself was created. In Milton's rendering, it is Jesus, the Son, who is sent forth by God to do the actual physical work of creating the world, though God's overshadowing spirit and might is the force that actually animates and inspires the physical world with life and spirit. So just take a sip in order to read it properly and do justice to the work. Heaven opened wide her ever-during gates, harmonious sound on golden hinges moving, to let forth the King of Glory and his powerful word and spirit coming to create new worlds. On heavenly ground they stood, and from the shore they viewed the vast, immeasurable abyss, outrageous as the sea, dark, wasteful, wild. Up from the bottom, turned by furious winds and surging waves, as mountains to assault heaven's height, and with center mix the pole. Silence, ye troubled waves, and thou deep, peace. said then the omnific word, your discord end. Nor stayed, but on the wings of cherubim uplifted, in paternal glory rode far into chaos and the world unborn. For chaos heard his voice, him all his train followed in bright procession to behold creation and the wonders of his might. Then stayed the fervid wheels, and in his hand he took the golden compasses, prepared in God's eternal store to circumscribe this universe and all created things. One foot he centered, and the other turned round through the vast profundity obscure, and said, thus far extend, thus far thy bounds. This be thy just circumference, O world. Thus God the heaven created, thus the earth. Paradise Lost, John Milton. Now this passage from Milton's Paradise Lost fully realizes the implicit realities of that simple Genesis statement that we were considering. And it does so with a powerful creative vision of God's work in designing our world. And of course, the power is all there in the Bible verse, to be sure. But Milton opens it up. He shares it with us in compelling blank verse. All right, and let's move on to Blake. You can look there in the handout at the frontispiece to Europe, a Prophecy, which was published in 1794. And this is William Blake here, so you can take a moment to view it. But entitled The Ancient of Days, it is an illuminated engraving that depicts the creation of the world by a God figure. Right? You can see the golden compasses in his hand as he describes the orb of the world, doing so from some place deep in the formless chaos of the void. And that is Blake's vision of what that original moment of creation might have looked like. It's a visual snapshot of that initial moment of creation, right? And the contrast of the colors with the dark nothingness, the powerful simplicity of the engraving. There's the lateral wind of eternity that caused God's beard and hair to rush out to the side. It's this wonderful visual sense of all that is implied in the line, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, what's really cool about this, about pairing Blake and Milton together, is that Blake actually loved Milton, right? He loved his work, was inspired by it. And hopefully you'll have noticed that a set of golden compasses shows up in Milton's epic and also in Blake's engraving. And Blake's engraving is thought to be, at least in part, inspired by Milton, right? So in pairing these two together, what you're actually seeing is an instant of Milton's art inspiring Blake and his sense of God's act of creation. And then Blake goes on to create another work of art that has since inspired the idea that other people have of God's act of creation by offering them the engraving that we've just seen. So we can see that what's forming there is actually this beautiful causal chain of inspiration where, we're sort of led, beginning with scripture, link by link, to Milton and Blake, and then on to us here tonight, right? And all along the way, our idea of God's act of creation is enlivened and inspired, right? And our faith is enriched by these visions of God's act of creation.